evening. On behalf of Asia Society Hong Kong, it's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight for it's going to be a wonderful talk. I know because having kind of discussed this with Stacey about over a month ago, and thanks to the introduction from Dee Dee and the two Dee Dees, I had a chance to meet Stacey in I think over the holidays, and we're so happy that before Stacey leaves us in end of April, that Asia Society Hong Kong has this opportunity to host her for this talk. And I want to again thank Tina for agreeing to help us moderate the Q&A. I first heard about Sir Percival David. I think it was at an Asia Society program. I think Dee Dee probably was there. It was the time when Asia Society, when Jillian So was our arts and cultural program person. And there was a wonderful talk about by Rosemary Scott. And I still have the book from Rosemary. And so it's great to now, we're going to hear more about Sir Percival David from Stacey tonight. And I know she'll tell you more about her book that she's working on. And this is what the beauty of Asia Society Hong Kong is about, is like I see a lot of familiar faces, people that over the years I've seen at programs like this. And we have some new faces. Some of you have not probably been to a program. I know some of you are young students working and interested in the field. But what I really love the program that we've been able to do is to be able to host Professor Stacey Pierson, who is Professor of History of Chinese Ceramic at SOAS at University of London. And she's here in Hong Kong as part of, I think, visiting scholar at CUHK, the Fine Art Department. And I think the visiting scholarship program is very much made possible by the Beishangtang Foundation. And we have our friends at Beishangtang here tonight. And we've been really fortunate to have collaborated with Beishangtang on forums, programs throughout the year, in the 13 years we've been here. So again, thank you for making, Stacey's visit possible to Hong Kong. And I think if we have seen what we've seen this last month, March, the excitement of the arts and cultural sector, the growth of the arts and cultural sector, that Asia Society Hong Kong is very much part of it. I know Tina knows more about it. It's despite what's happening in the world, I to be honest with you, I stay away from the news these days. And I enjoy either coming to our program lives, and I enjoy programming things that would be of interest to me and others, our members. And also, if you have some time on your hand, a lot of these programs are available on our YouTube channel. In fact, we just heard last time, about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, we hosted Professor Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs. We had we put together a program very quickly for Professor Sachs, and it got on the YouTube yesterday. Overnight, 41,000 viewers. So it's things like this that we're really proud of. And I know, Stacey, you're going to get equal number of viewers because it is things that we are interested in. It is important that we kind of don't let all the noises around the world and all the conflicts kind of get in the way of our continuous learning. And I think I remember that first talk. Again, I had no idea who Rosemary Scott was. I knew she was working at Christie's at that time, and that program kind of seared in my mind. And every time I had a chance to go to London, I discovered the Sir Percival David collection. So whenever I go there, I go and see the collection. And now to be able to have a host, Stacey here at Asia Society Hong Kong, it is really, it's been 20 years since that talk. I think Dee Dee would know. So this is the beauty of the society. We're celebrating our 35th anniversary this year. It's been, we were founded in 1990. And so to be able to still, now with the site, with the venue, this last 13 years, to continue to host program and now to do more of it. And I think that is something that I'm particularly proud of. And I want to thank all of you for your support. And those of you who are members, thank you. Those of you who are not, consider becoming a member, because we're going to bring you more programs like this in the future, long as we're here, and we're going to be here for a long time. So with that, I'm going to invite Professor Pierson, Stacey, to go up and to start her presentation, and it will be followed by Q&A moderated by Tina Pang. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice, and also thank you for inviting me to share my long-term research project with the Asia Society. Now, my talk tonight starts with an event that hit the headlines in London last November. And this was the British Museum received record 1 billion donation of Chinese ceramics. The collection was apparently the highest value gift of objects in UK museum history. And of course, what they were given was the former Sir Percival David collection. Now, the collection had been on display in the British Museum. I'm sure plenty of you, when you've been to London, have seen it in its relatively new home in room 95. But it was technically still on loan to the British Museum. So the difference is, over time, the trustees of the collection decided that the best permanent home for it would be the National Collection, which is in the British Museum. And so last November, the gift was made official. So now it actually belongs to the nation. I mean, I might question the valuation as being a little bit ambitious, but it got the headline. So for those of you in the audience who may not know this collection and may not know who the collector is, one of the reasons why it's considered so valuable, and this was such, a munificent gift to the nation, is because this collection of Chinese ceramics is considered one of the finest in the world, second only, if that, to the former imperial collections from China. So this was indeed an incredibly generous gift, and it ensures the permanent future of this collection. Now, my history with this collection started back in 1995, when I joined the museum that it was in at the University of London as assistant curator. And I was extremely fortunate because my former teacher, Rosemary Scott, who we've just heard about, was the chief curator of the museum. And so when I got the call that I was the successful candidate, I screamed and dropped a phone because, it was really my dream job. And it was, in fact, a dream collection for any curator, young or old, to work with. So when I joined the foundation back in 1995, one of the things I had to do was learn more about the history of the collection and the history of the collector. And so fortunately, relatively recently, Romy had published, as you can see there, a new history of the museum and the collection. And she had very presciently, as it happened, asked Lady David, who you can see there on the right, who was the collector's widow, to actually write the introduction to this new guide, and an introduction to not just the collection, but its history, and to, her husband, Percival David. So that's what my knowledge and all of our knowledge was based on at the time. That's, in case you're wondering, that's not me in the old building. That's me in the newer gallery in the British Museum. So her essay was actually really key knowledge, and it proved to be one of the few biographies that would exist of Percival David, because she died about 6 months after I joined the museum. And so fortunately, Romy had interviewed her and asked her to write this. And in her biography, which is very readable, she says, by way of introduction, that in its superlative quality, the collection is unparalleled. It was assembled under ideal conditions by a connoisseur with a restlessly probing mind and keen aesthetic judgment. He was born a collector, possessing great pertinacity and a retentive visual memory that enabled him to seize every opportunity to make important additions to his collection. And then, summing it up, she said, Sir Percival's intense interest in and profound knowledge of Chinese ceramics enabled him to form an unrivaled collection. And he wanted, above all else, to find a suitable home for it, so that it would be an instrument of teaching for serious-minded students and at the same time be available for public viewing. And he succeeded in doing that. Now, of course, a lot of that language is typical of the flattering language that's used to sort of create an impression of collectors as being, unparalleled and being exceptional. And most of the time, that is just flattery, but in Percival David's case, it actually holds true. So I thought. Okay. So if you read more of her introduction, she actually provides a short biography of David and talks us through some of the key events in his life as a collector. So she starts with the fact that he was born in India in 1892. He succeeded to the title of baronet in 1926. He graduated from Cambridge with a law degree, but decided to make Chinese art, quote, his sphere of endeavor. Apparently already knowing Chinese language, he visited China in 1924 to study connoisseurship, that is Chinese-style connoisseurship, and the imperial collection, the pinnacle of all collections. And while there, he financed a display for the new museum. What she means is a display for the museum that would open in 1925 as the Palace Museum in Beijing. So in 1927, he went back to China and buys pieces from the former imperial collection. This was written in 1989. I'll just remind you of that. And in 1931, he meets her, Sheila, and shows her his fabulous collection. I don't think that's a euphemism, but they were together for a long time, so you never know. She then said he established the chair of Chinese art and archaeology at University of London. And then in 1935, he originated and organized the greatest exhibition of Chinese art the world has ever seen. What she's referring to there, of course, is what was called the International Exhibition of Chinese Art, which was held at the Royal Academy in the fall of 1935 and spring of 1936. And still to this day, it is seen to be one of the most successful exhibitions in Royal Academy history, with the second highest number of visitors of all time. And this is 1935 and Chinese art. So then she goes on to talk about slightly later years, which she calls the war years, when in 1939 he sent his collection and library, because he had an extensive library of reference materials related to the collection. He sent that out of London for safety. He, quote, makes a contribution to the war effort, and she said it was through financing construction of Mosquito aircraft. They, as it turned out she was with him, were interned by the Japanese in Shanghai in 1941, and then exchanged 1 year later for Japanese citizens held in Mozambique. So they're in Africa, they go to Johannesburg, and she said they go for medical treatment. And that's because during his time in China, the symptoms of an undiagnosed but somewhat debilitating illness were developing and got worse. And it turns out later he would be diagnosed with ALS. So that's a degenerative motor neuron disease. He then formulates a plan to donate the collection to a suitable institution, offers it to University of London in 1950, who enthusiastically accepted, and then the museum, called the Percival David Foundation of Chinese Art, opened to the public in 1952, and he appointed Sheila, Lady David, as its first curator. And then sadly, in 1964, he died from complications of ALS. Okay, so this paints a picture of a very accomplished, very dedicated, and really quite remarkable person, who created, this incredible collection that was really a gift at that time to the nation as well. And then slightly later in my career, I had the opportunity to pursue doctoral studies that I had put off when I first started working because, of course, I was so excited to be appointed assistant curator. I'm like, forget that doctorate. But then I realized, I shouldn't put it off because I wanted to pursue the research. And my topic generally was looking at collectors founded by museums and the role of this type of museum in shaping fields of art history and collecting. And I used the Percival David Foundation of Chinese Art as a case study. And it was perfect for that. And in the course of this, it enabled me to really further investigate his personal history, the collector's history, as well as the history of the collection. How did he form this remarkable collection? But soon after I started the research, I discovered there were some significant challenges. The biggest one is that there's no Percival David archive. There are no personal papers, nothing to look at. Either he intentionally didn't preserve them, or some people have said, according to his wishes, his widow, Lady David, also did not preserve them. So that's a significant hurdle. I also discovered that much of the information provided by her could not be verified. That was another challenge. And crucially, her account leaves out really key personal information, including the most important key to him and his background, which is that he was a Sassoon. There was no mention of this. I remember thinking when I first got to the museum that, he's obviously Jewish. I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood, so he just seemed like he had a Jewish name. Never was mentioned. And so his Jewish background wasn't mentioned ever. I didn't know he was a Sassoon. And I also didn't know that there was another Lady David. So, there was a first wife and a family associated with that. But fortunately, he participated in a lot of public activities, and so there are a lot of parallel sources you can look to investigate him and his background. So newspaper articles, war records, university archives, and shout out to the Mormons. Their genealogy project database is a goldmine for researchers because it's available online for free under something called Family Search. I have found so much information about his travels, who he was with in this particular database. So that was key. Other things include, there's a lot of information about the family in general. And, of course, he was born in India during British rule. So a lot of those family records are actually available in English Public Record Office. So all the National Archives have information about the Davids, the Sassoons, etc. So it wasn't completely impossible, but over time, it did take me many, many years to piece together enough so that I felt I could fill in the gaps in his story so that we could understand how this remarkable collection came about. So my updated version includes a lot more information that can also signal and lead us to crucial stages in the forming of the collection. So we know that he was born in India, but now we know that he was born in India into a prominent Baghdadi Jewish family, the Sassoons. His mother was a Sassoon, a direct descendant of the man David Sassoon, who's considered the patriarch of the Sassoon dynasty. In 1912, he moved to London and married Vere Moselle David, his first cousin. So he obviously was sent there to marry her, and she later would become the first Lady David. He also started collecting in 1914. So he got married in 1913, bought his first piece of Chinese ceramic in 1914, quite early. In the 1920s, he bought a really famous country house that's called Friar Park. It's famous today because later, it was purchased by one of the Beatles, George Harrison. And George Harrison's widow still lives at Friar Park. I've asked a million times if I can go see it, and she always says no, but I can keep trying. So he buys Friar Park, which is this incredible, in good ways and bad ways. The design is crazy. In England, it's outside Henley, if you know your English geography. And he settled there with his family, his first wife, their 2 children, and I don't know why, but her brothers were all living there as well. Anyways, so they settled there in 1920, and then in 1926, his father dies, and that's why Sir Percival inherits the title, the baronetcy, in 1926. He also inherited the family business, and he, throughout the 1920s, is continuing to build up the collection, traveling extensively, including to China, and he starts carrying out really significant Jewish philanthropic works, including funding the building of a new synagogue in London, in Holland Park, which is now named after his father. In the 1930s, I think this is really his most active decade as a collector. He becomes really active in universities, in museums. He actually funded acquisitions for the British Museum, the V&A, lots of other collections. He was active in collector groups, including the Oriental Ceramic Society in London. He expanded the scope of his collecting to include paintings and rare Chinese books. And he continued to travel widely, especially in the planning of that 1935 international exhibition. It brought him here, actually, to Hong Kong several times. So World War II starts, and he stores the collection, as we heard, but also another collection, which we didn't know about, and that was the collection of something called the Warburg Institute, which is a research institute now at the University of London that was founded in Hamburg in late 1920s by Abby Warburg, who was, one of the Warburg painting heirs. It is a collection of images, books, and materials all associated with initially Renaissance art history, but then it's expanded to sort of global art history. So during the war, of course, London's being heavily bombed, right? So the collection of the Warburg Institute, through David's auspices, was moved out to Friar Park and stored there. He stored 1/3 of the collection, plus their library catalog. And if he hadn't done that, it would have been destroyed. So that was really crucial. So he then travels on behalf of his family company to offer assistance with aircraft building. I've subsequently found out it was something else, but I'll get to that later. He then arrives in Shanghai in 1941 in December. Quite an unfortunate time to arrive, and he's placed under house arrest. He wasn't interned because, of course, the internment camps weren't built at that stage. So his health did suffer, but he still somehow managed to add to his collection while he's under house arrest. And he was under house arrest in one of the Sassoon properties that, is the Peace Hotel. So 1942, he's released along with a bunch of, a huge number of Japanese civilians who had been themselves interned in places like the United States and Brazil. And they were all exchanged in Mozambique, which was under Portuguese rule, so it was neutral. He then stays in Africa, particularly in South Africa, to kind of recover and try and seek treatment for his developing ALS. But at the same time, he thinks he's going to die. And I've only discovered this because of the letter that I found in the Warburg Institute. So he's writing to the director there, who's a friend of his, saying, I don't think I'm long for this world. I want to find a home for my collection. And it's really the director of the Warburg who convinces him to give it to the University of London, because, he had a connection to it before. So he donates the collection, and the museum opens in 1952. Now that year, his daughter, his one surviving daughter, the other one died in infancy. She got married. And so then it was socially acceptable for him to get divorced from his first wife. And then he married Sheila. So then Sheila became the second Lady David. And he, as we saw, made her curator of the PDF. And he actually also made it a condition of the gift that he be given a flat on site. So he lived in the building because, of course, he couldn't go back to Friar Park, right? So he lived in a building, and it's, did anyone in the audience ever go to the old PDF building? Yeah, a few of you. So you might remember that it had this tiny little elevator. I mean, it always used to make people laugh because it was so small. But that was actually a really early lift or elevator that was installed in the building just for Percival David because he was in a wheelchair at the time he moved into that space. So that's why it had that tiny little elevator. So he lives on site and with Lady David, and then eventually he dies. And he's survived by, obviously, the two Lady Davids, but the second Lady David is his widow and his daughter with his first wife. But he left nothing to anybody. He left no endowment. He didn't leave anything to Sheila, apart from maybe the equivalent of 10,000 pounds and a flat. So that was good. But the lack of endowment was a problem. So until 2007, his museum was actually funded by a government grant that was set aside for university museums. And so when it ran out, that's why the collection had to find a new home, as it happens, the British Museum. So it moved to the British Museum in 2009, and that's where it lives in room 95. So this much more detailed and much fuller biography of him really helps us to understand a lot more about who he was and the world he was operating in, I think. And it made me think that we need to kind of understand not just the facts of his life, but the real experience of his life. So drawing together some of this information, I started thinking about, how could we try to understand what it was like to be Percival David while he was living, based on the new knowledge that I was able to acquire. And so this is just a selection, but if we look at his family, we now know who his father was, Sir Sassoon J. David. We know his cousin, his first cousin was Victor. That's Victor Sassoon with his party face on. Victor Sassoon aunt was Percival David's mother, Hannah Sassoon. We also know that he had another wife and a family. Vera was his first wife, and then Sheila. And we know about his friends as well. I mean, a lot of his friends were involved in Chinese art world and China, because that was his main interest, including some of you might know the collector Oscar Rafel. I know it looks like Raphael, but a member of the family chided me after I gave a lecture recently and said, no, we don't pronounce it Raphael, it's Rafel. So, okay. So Oscar Rafel, great collector who died, I think in 1940, was a real kind of mentor to Percival David. He also knew the famous Chinese photographer, Lang Jingshan, wrote an introduction to a book of his photographs, by the way. He was friends with the Crown Prince of Sweden, who himself had a good collection of Chinese art. He was even friends with Reginald Johnson, the man, the Scottish diplomat who had been the tutor to the last emperor. And he also was appointed, though apparently he never showed up for work, he was appointed a professor of Chinese at SOAS, my university in 1931. And, lots of other people. We also know a lot more about Percival's business life, his work. He was chairman of the company, Sassoon, David & Co., from 1926. And this was an international company. It had offices in Bombay, in London, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in Kobe. And then we also know he had multiple homes, that amazing estate, Friar Park. His London place, as you do, was a giant suite in the Dorchester Hotel. And that happened to be where he met Sheila, who was working there. And then, of course, he lived in the museum building for the last few years of his life. And if you were a man of any stature in England, wealth, particularly with an aristocratic title, which he had, you were members of clubs. And looking at what clubs people belong to can tell you a lot about their life. For example, he was a member of the Athenaeum, which is one of the venerable old gentlemen's clubs in London. He was also a member of that's Burlington Fine Arts Club, which was also a gentleman's club, but dedicated to just collecting and exhibitions. OCS, Society of Antiquaries, and one that surprised me is the Royal Anthropological Institute. A lot of people who were interested in archaeology and funding archaeological expeditions and digs were members of that society. Royal Society of Arts, and then the one that took me down a rabbit hole I didn't want to go into, which was the Royal Philatelic Society. Okay, so I'm over it now, but it was kind of a shock at the time. So that brings me to another area in which I was able to paint a much fuller picture, not just of the man, but also his collection. So if we were to paint a picture of the Percival David collection before he donated it to University of London, this is what it would have looked like, not just ceramics. The ceramics were a selection of the collection plus one painting that he gave to the university. In fact, his collecting interests were much wider. And it unfortunately appears that his first collecting interest and one of his main collecting interests was stamps. So I have anecdotal evidence that I need to verify that the first thing he bought was not the ceramic in 1914, but stamps in 1913. So just to give you a sense of his stature in that world, if you talk to stamp collectors, particularly collectors of what they call China, his name has enough and adds enough value as a provenance in the stamp world as it does in the world of Chinese ceramics. So I would meet collectors who say, oh, I own a David X, like I own a David vase, right? And I'm like, oh, cool, but I was, pleasantly surprised by that. And I also discovered that he, from quite an early date was winning awards for medals for his Chinese stamp collection. Now, in an interview that Lady David did for Anthony Lynn, who used to work at Christie's, she said, it was published in Orientations, I think, she mentioned very briefly that they had a stamp collection, but nothing further. So this I only found out much more about by accident. So just to give you a sense of the value, that stamp there is called a dowager something. I mean, I'm going to learn all the terms, I promise. But and it's particularly important because it has, you see that upside down stamp on top of it that has like a 10-cent surcharge. Apparently that's really significant. That one sold in Hong Kong in 2019 for over 6 million Hong Kong dollars. Just a little stamp. Yeah. Okay, so he's collecting stamps. He's also collecting rare books. Now, we knew about that, but I discovered he bought his first Chinese rare books in 1918, much earlier than we thought. That's one of the ones he collected while he was under house arrest in Shanghai. I covered up the whole title of it, but it's actually, if you go the third character down, it's the Gugu Yaolun, which was first written in 1388, and it's considered to be the oldest or the first Ming connoisseurship text. And then, of course, he was collecting jade as well. So when he was in China, he didn't just buy ceramics from the former imperial collection. He also bought jade. That's Qianlong, and it's today in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. And then he collected that object. Now, this is also quite a famous object, that silver vessel. It's called the Raft Cup because it's in the shape of a raft. And this is in the Cleveland Museum of Art. He owned it at the time of the 1935 exhibition. And as director of the exhibition, he was also one of the biggest lenders, so lots of things from his collection were included. And I discovered a film, a Pathé film, of the unpacking of a lot of the exhibits that had been loaned from China for the first time. I guess it was like an unboxing, right? And it shows Percival David, with some of the representatives from the Palace Museum unpacking bronzes and things. And then it pans to a table that has exhibits on it, and that piece is shown very prominently in that film. He also collected lacquer. That's an early Ming piece that was sold by you guys, Christie's. I can't remember when. It was like 2008 or 9. Anyways, I hope it got a lot. I don't know. But he was collecting. He had quite a few pieces of early Ming lacquer, and some of them ended up in the collection of the Crown Prince of Sweden in Stockholm. And then, of course, the ceramics we know about. He collected some very important paintings. That's a detail of a Tang Dynasty painting by Han Gan, which is a portrait of one of the imperial horses, which he bought in Shanghai. And it's today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then one thing that really surprised me was it turns out he was very interested in maps. So he owned that globe, and that globe is considered to be the oldest surviving Chinese globe. It was created by 2 missionaries while they were in China around 1600. And he gave it to the British Museum in the 1950s, and it's now in the British Library collection. So I think you can see even his collecting activities were much wider than anybody ever knew. And it just took a lot of very sort of parallel research in order to bring together all this disparate information. So I think if you are trying to find a way to put all this together that would kind of create a sort of meaningful story of David and the collection. And I think if you look at these activity spheres and knit them together, you can see that what they represent is a very full and detailed kind of collecting life that is made up of all these elements that come together to create what I'm really just calling a collecting world. So the activities include, all the things I've told you about, but then there are also some things we didn't know about that we have to add to this picture. So visualizing it, you can see these activities are representing a kind of collecting life and world. And in order to create this world-class collection, you need to make judicious choices. I mean, obviously that's part of it, and obviously having the money to do so is another part of it. But you also need to be doing this in particular circumstances. And in this particular case, the circumstances were kind of exceptional. They represented really unique circumstances that enabled the creation of this collection and of this collecting life. And it was this collecting life that David himself created and shaped. So if you're looking at what he revealed about his life, and therefore I think we can assume that what Sheila wrote in her introduction is what he also authorized. So anything that's left out was intentional. If you look at what was revealed, so we know a lot about his buying and collecting of lots of things. We know about his scholarship because, he was also learning Chinese, he's collecting rare books, and he's also publishing a lot, As it happens, he didn't go to Cambridge. He was not a lawyer. He actually had no tertiary education, but he was clearly a very bright man. Because there is evidence that he could definitely read Chinese. I mean, he was scribbling on his books and doing translations himself. So we know about the scholarship because he wanted us to. We know about the exhibitions and the museum, of course, that he created. But the things he obscured are also important because, as I pointed out, we know a lot more about his family and his home life, and that underpinned a lot of what he was doing as a collector. We also know about his philanthropy, which was intentionally obscured by him, by them, which was a major part of his, maybe his other life, if you will. But then there was something that was completely hidden in all this: his work, the business, and the finances. There was no mention of this anywhere. So if you want to find out what's in that activity sphere, what do? Follow the money, right? If you follow the money, a new picture emerges. So by investigating the company, Sassoon J. David and Co., I discovered so much about the business's interests, which were typically of a Sassoon-related business, very wide-ranging. So, of course, initially, his father made his fortune in opium, but then that also then included cotton mills, cotton textiles, steel, cement, property, banking, insurance, and something that really surprised me was something that I discovered thanks to the fact that I'm here as a visiting scholar, so I have access to all these databases that I don't have. And one of them is the archive of the South China Morning Post, another gold mine. And I discovered this little tidbit there, which was published in November of 1941, that says, Manila. The China Clipper left for Singapore this morning, and included in the passenger list was Sir Percival David, munitions tycoon. So clearly I need to add munitions to the list of business interests of Sassoon J. David and Co. And then I discovered that company was supplying Colt pistols to the Shanghai Municipal Police, for example. So, and those who are interested in war history, I thought the next paragraph was quite interesting. So Percival asserted that British defense program is moving smoothly and is making preparations for a 5-year war if necessary. So, okay, so I find out about the business, and now I know that he was actively running the business. I also discovered that he inherited an absolute fortune as well when his father died. And that is in the form of the trust his father set up, which he called the Baronetcy Trust Fund. So that funded everything, including, the purchase of Friar Park. And while he's actively running the company, nonetheless, he's still actively pursuing a sideline in collecting Chinese art. And the fact that he has the time and the energy to do this is quite remarkable. So I was looking into the company's various locations, and that, brought me to Hong Kong, of course. And thanks to the fabulous website Gulo, I found that picture of what was called David House. And so that was the company headquarters here in Hong Kong, and it was located at the corner of Davao Road and Pottinger Street. I mean, the building was torn down, but the chairman or the director at that branch was his uncle / father-in-law, A.J. David, who I discovered lived on Mount Gough in the Peak. So this was all quite significant, but it was a recent research trip I took with a very able research coordinator, Didi, to Mumbai that also proved to be really significant for my understanding of David and his life and his Chinese art world. Because I could see that when we tried to walk in the footsteps of Percival David and his father, there was a lot of important buildings that had existed in their time were still there. We could visit them, including that synagogue, which is where his parents got married. That's an old picture. It's absolutely crumbling. We were kind of terrified that we'd be hit by rubble while we were in it. But we could also visit the Prince of Wales Museum, which is one of the many buildings financed by Percival David's father in Bombay. And it was also part of a still visible Baghdadi Jewish world in Mumbai that Percival David clearly was brought up in, and it really informed who he was. But what really stood out was just how important his father was as a figure in Bombay society. He was so well respected. He had multiple titles. His name was on so many things. And it made me think that there's probably a good reason that Percival David, after he was sent to London to establish the David Company presence there, had to marry his first cousin. Maybe they were happy for a while, but who knows? He was living in the shadow of his father, because when he first got there, he was just living the life of a rich sort of playboy. He had a family, but he had nothing to do, so he was just spending money. And fortunately, for whatever reason, he had this interest in China and Chinese objects, Chinese art. And he had the determination, and as it happens, the aptitude, the skill, and then the money to really pursue this as something for himself. Because I could see that he was so much in the shadow as his father that he wanted to establish his own identity in a way that would help him gain stature in his own right. So that is why I decided to tentatively title the book that I'm working on of all this, Merchant of India, Collector of China, The Parallel Lives of Sir Percival David. And that's a picture I just found of him in a newspaper in South Africa, which I've never seen him smiling before, and wearing glasses too. So that's the true story of Percival David and his collection. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stacey. What an amazing talk. Lots of new information, I'm sure, for many of the audience, certainly for me. I think I'd like to start with asking how he learned Chinese. That's a real mystery.
Yeah, I wish I knew. I found some papers that suggest he had a personal tutor. There's a reference to a personal tutor, but it doesn't say for what. I can't think of anything else it would be, but that's something I've only recently found, and so I'm looking into it, but there otherwise is no other evidence. He did come from a world where personal tutors were standard, however, and so I think if he actively wanted to learn something like that, he would have just hired somebody. There's evidence that in the scribbles in his books that he did know it, perhaps not as early as 1924, but I think 1926-ish. So I wish I knew exactly how it all happened, but. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's so many mysteries, I think, about his early life. So he born in India, and when was his first trip to China?
His first trip to China was actually in 1921, but Lady Sheila David said it was 1924. That trip, I only have the record because I actually have his old passports, and another incredibly lucky source of research material, yeah, I know I'm not going to use it, but so one of the former trustees of the museum had been a young lawyer who represented Percival and Lady David, and for some reason he had Percival David's estate file, and he let me look at it. So that's a key source of information. And his old passports were in it, so I could see where he was going and when. And like the old stamps have a lot more information in them. And so the first trip was 1921. I'm assuming to do with the family business.
So the family business is based in Shanghai. Do we know if he traveled very much elsewhere? Obviously, he was involved with the founding of the Palace Museum, so he must have gone to Beijing.
Do you mean traveled within China?
Yeah.
Oh, I have evidence that he was in Tianjin. Again, I'm assuming for business. I mean, it was obviously, let's see, Shanghai, Beijing, Tianjin. As far as I know, I don't remember seeing any other sites in China that he went to. But, I found out he'd been in Korea. I mean, literally all over the world.
Well, thank you so much to you both. What a great program. And again, thank you all for being here. And the book is coming out when?
Well, I'm still looking to get a contract. So fingers
I'm sure you have
crossed,
no
it will
problem.
come out next year.
Well, when it comes out, we'll welcome you back. And again, thank you all for being here. And by the way, Stacey's giving another talk tomorrow at the Palace Museum. So if feel free to let your friends know it's a public talk. So tomorrow there is another talk at the Palace Museum. So
And it's related to their new exhibition called A Movable Feast. So I'll be talking about the Tang ceramics in that exhibition and their relationship to metalwork from West Asia and Central Asia.
thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Stacey.
so much. And thank you all for being here. And we look forward to seeing you at future programs. Thank you.